The morning sun blazed over the dusty training ground at Fort Braxton, casting long shadows across the obstacle course that had broken more soldiers than it had made. General Marcus Caldwell stood on the observation deck, his chest heavy with medals that caught the light like mirrors. His uniform was pressed to perfection, every crease sharp enough to cut paper. At 52, he carried himself with the kind of authority that made junior officers step aside when he walked down hallways. Caldwell had earned his stars the hard way, or so he told everyone who would listen. 3 tours in Afghanistan, 2 in Iraq, and countless smaller operations that never made the evening news. His office walls were covered with commendations, photographs with politicians, and newspaper clippings that painted him as a war hero. But those who served under him knew a different story. They whispered about how he always managed to be in the rear when bullets started flying, how his greatest victories seemed to happen when other men did the dying. Below on the training ground, a group of Navy SEALs was running through combat scenarios. Caldwell watched them with the kind of disdain he usually reserved for enlisted men who forgot to salute. Special Operations Forces rubbed him the wrong way. They operated outside the normal chain of command, got special treatment, and, worst of all, they got all the glory in the press. Real soldiers, Caldwell believed, followed orders and respected rank. These SEALs thought they were above such things. "Sir," said Lieutenant Colonel Barnes, approaching with a clipboard tucked under his arm. Barnes was Caldwell's aide, a nervous man who had learned to read his superior's moods like a weather forecast. "The Navy SEAL team has requested permission to use the Advanced Medical Training Facility for their next exercise." Caldwell's jaw tightened. "Denied. That facility is for real soldiers, not these showboat sailors who think they're cowboys." He spat the words out like they tasted bad. Barnes shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, with respect, they have authorization from the Pentagon. This is part of a joint training exercise specifically designed to improve cooperation between branches." "I don't care if it's authorized by God himself," Caldwell snapped. "This is my base, and I decide who uses what facilities. These SEALs want to play soldier, they can do it with the standard equipment." Down on the field, the SEAL team was wrapping up their morning run. They moved with the fluid efficiency that came from years of training together, each man knowing exactly where his teammates were without looking. At the front of the group ran Petty Officer First Class Jake Morrison, the team's medic. Morrison was 31 years old, built like a marathon runner rather than a bodybuilder, but those who underestimated him based on his lean frame usually regretted it quickly. Morrison had joined the Navy straight out of high school in a small Ohio town where the biggest excitement was Friday night football games. His father had been a medic in Vietnam, and Morrison grew up hearing stories about saving lives under fire. Those stories had shaped his dreams, and he'd pushed himself through SEAL training with a determination that impressed even the instructors. What set Morrison apart wasn't just his medical skills, though those were exceptional. It was his ability to stay calm when everything went wrong. His teammates called him Doc, and they meant it with respect. In 3 tours overseas, Morrison had saved more lives than he could count, often while enemy bullets whistled overhead. He'd pulled wounded soldiers from burning vehicles, performed surgery in mud-filled foxholes, and once carried an unconscious Marine through 2 miles of hostile territory to reach an extraction point. But Morrison had 2 qualities that men like General Caldwell found particularly irritating. First, he didn't back down when he believed he was right, regardless of who was giving orders. Second, he had a way of making difficult things look easy, which made officers who had never been tested feel inadequate. As the SEAL team finished their run, they gathered around their commanding officer, Commander Sarah Chun, for the daily briefing. Chun was a compact woman with iron gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. She'd been leading special operations teams for 12 years and had earned her position through competence, not politics. "All right, listen up," Chun began. "Today we're supposed to conduct medical training exercises using the advanced facility. However, we've just been informed that General Caldwell has denied our request to use it." The team exchanged glances. This wasn't the first time Caldwell had made their lives difficult. Over the past month, he'd found ways to restrict their access to equipment, delay their supply requests, and generally make their stay at Fort Braxton as unpleasant as possible. "What's the alternative plan, Commander?" asked Morrison. "We'll make do with what we have," Chen replied. "Set up the medical training scenario in the old hangar. We've improvised in worse conditions." Morrison nodded, but his jaw was tight. He understood the politics of military life, but when training suffered, lives could be lost in real operations. The advanced medical facility had equipment that could simulate battlefield injuries with remarkable accuracy, helping medics practice procedures that might mean the difference between life and death for wounded soldiers. As the team dispersed to prepare their equipment, Morrison noticed General Caldwell descending from the observation deck, flanked by his usual entourage of staff officers. Caldwell's expression suggested he was looking for trouble, and his eyes fixed on Morrison with unmistakable hostility. "You there, sailor," Caldwell called out, his voice carrying across the field. Morrison stopped and turned, coming to attention. Military protocol demanded respect for rank, regardless of personal feelings. "Yes, sir," Morrison replied. Caldwell approached with the swagger of a man used to having others clear his path. "I understand you people are upset about not getting access to the medical facility." "Sir, we're adapting to the situation as ordered," Morrison said carefully. "Good, because I want to make something clear." Caldwell stepped closer, invading Morrison's personal space in a move designed to intimidate. "This is an Army base, not some playground for Navy prima donnas who think they're special. You'll use the equipment you're given and be grateful for it." Morrison felt his teammates watching from nearby. He could sense their tension, knew they were ready to support him if this confrontation escalated. But he also knew that losing his temper would only make things worse for everyone. "Understood, sir," Morrison said evenly. But Caldwell wasn't finished. He'd been looking for an excuse to put these SEALs in their place, and Morrison's calm response only irritated him more. In Caldwell's experience, soldiers were supposed to show fear when dressed down by a general. Morrison's composure felt like insubordination. "I've been watching you people," Caldwell continued, his voice rising, "thinking you're better than regular soldiers, walking around like you own the place. But when it comes down to it, you're just sailors playing dress-up in combat gear." The insult hung in the air like smoke. Around the field, other soldiers had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation. Morrison felt the weight of their attention, knew that how he handled this moment would define not just his own reputation, but how people viewed his entire team. "Sir, we're here to train and improve our capabilities to serve our country," Morrison said. "That's our only objective." Caldwell's face flushed red. Morrison's refusal to rise to the bait made him look foolish in front of the watching soldiers, and that was unforgivable. The general had built his career on intimidation and bluster, and when those tools failed, he had few others to fall back on. "Your objective," Caldwell snarled, "is to follow orders and show proper respect to your superiors. Maybe you SEALs need a reminder of how things work in the real military." Morrison remained silent, knowing that anything he said would only escalate the situation. But his silence seemed to enrage Caldwell even more. "Perhaps a practical demonstration would help," Caldwell said, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "I challenge you to a marksmanship competition. 5 rounds, standard targets at 300 yards. When I win, maybe you'll understand that rank and experience matter more than fancy training." The challenge caught Morrison off guard. Military competitions between different branches weren't unusual, but this felt different. This was personal, and it was happening in front of an audience that included both Army soldiers and Morrison's own teammates. Commander Chen stepped forward, sensing the dangerous direction this was heading. "Sir, perhaps we should focus on the day's training schedule rather than this is between me and your medic," Caldwell cut her off. "Unless he's afraid to accept a simple challenge from an old Army general." Morrison looked around at the faces watching him. Some showed curiosity, others concern. His teammates' expressions were carefully neutral, but he knew they trusted him to handle this appropriately. The Army soldiers seemed split between loyalty to their general and curiosity about how the confrontation would play out. "Sir, I accept your challenge," Morrison said quietly. Caldwell's smile widened. "Excellent. We'll use standard M4 rifles, iron sights only. 5 rounds each at 300 yards. Winner takes bragging rights." What Caldwell didn't know, what none of the watching soldiers knew, was that Morrison had grown up hunting in the forests of Ohio with his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had been a sniper in the Pacific. Morrison had been shooting since he was 8 years old, and his natural talent had been honed by years of military training. In his SEAL team, he was often called upon for long-range precision work that required the kind of steady nerves and perfect technique that couldn't be taught in basic training. But Morrison also knew that winning this competition could be just as dangerous as losing it. Humiliating a general in public would create an enemy who could make his career very difficult. On the other hand, losing deliberately would damage his credibility with his own team and the watching soldiers. As they walked toward the firing range, Morrison made his decision. He would shoot to the best of his ability and let the results speak for themselves. Whatever happened afterward, he would face with the same calm determination that had carried him through 3 combat tours. The firing range at Fort Braxton was a long, flat stretch of ground with targets set at various distances. The 300-yard markers were visible as small dots in the distance, barely larger than coins to the naked eye. A slight breeze stirred the grass, adding another variable to the equation. Word of the competition had spread quickly through the base, and soldiers began gathering along the observation area. Some came out of curiosity, others because they'd heard rumors about Morrison's reputation. A few senior NCOs showed up, drawn by the unusual sight of a general personally competing against an enlisted man. Master Sergeant Rodriguez, the range safety officer, checked both rifles carefully before handing them over. Both weapons were identical M4 carbines with standard iron sights, the kind of rifle every soldier learned to shoot in basic training. There would be no advantage from equipment, only from skill and experience. General Caldwell took his position at the firing line with obvious confidence. He'd been bragging about his marksmanship skills for years, and while some of his stories were exaggerated, he genuinely was a competent shooter. He'd qualified expert on the rifle range multiple times and had even won a few competitions during his earlier career. Morrison settled into position beside him, checking his rifle with the methodical care of a professional. He adjusted his sling, tested the trigger pull, and sighted down the barrel to familiarize himself with the weapon's characteristics. These small preparations took only seconds, but they demonstrated a level of expertise that caught the attention of the watching soldiers. "Shooters ready?" called Master Sergeant Rodriguez. Both men signaled their readiness. With a magazine of 5 rounds, load and lock. The metallic sound of magazines being inserted and charging handles being pulled echoed across the range. Morrison chambered his first round and settled into a comfortable prone position, his breathing deep and controlled. "Target appears," Rodriguez announced, though the targets had been visible all along. Caldwell fired first, the sharp crack of his rifle breaking the morning stillness. Through binoculars, spotters could see that his shot had hit the target near the outer edge of the scoring rings. It was a decent shot, though not spectacular. Morrison took his time, feeling the rhythm of his breathing, waiting for the moment between heartbeats when his body was completely still. His first shot rang out, and the spotters called back that it had struck very close to the center of the target. The competition continued with both men firing their remaining rounds. Caldwell's shots were consistent, all hitting the target in the scoring area, but none achieving the precision that would mark him as an exceptional marksman. He was performing exactly as expected for an officer who practiced regularly, but didn't specialize in shooting. Morrison's shots told a different story. Each round struck the target with mechanical precision, clustering in a group so tight that the spotters had to look carefully to count all 5 holes. It was the kind of shooting that comes from years of practice combined with natural talent, the kind of performance that made other soldiers stop talking and pay attention. As the smoke cleared and the spotters tallied the scores, a hush fell over the watching crowd. General Caldwell had shot well enough to pass any military qualification, but Morrison's performance was in a completely different class. The difference wasn't just in points scored. It was in the demonstration of mastery that separated a competent shooter from a true marksman. Master Sergeant Rodriguez walked back from checking the targets, his expression carefully neutral. He'd been running firing ranges for 22 years and had seen thousands of soldiers shoot. Morrison's performance ranked among the best he'd ever witnessed, but he also understood the delicate politics of the situation. "Sir," Rodriguez said to Caldwell, "your score is 43 out of 50. All shots in the scoring area, with 3 in the inner rings." Caldwell nodded, confident that this was a score that would be difficult to beat. He'd shot better than many soldiers half his age, and he expected Morrison to struggle with the pressure of the situation. "Petty Officer Morrison," Rodriguez continued, his voice carrying across the silent range, "your score is 50 out of 50. 5 shots, all in the center ring." The silence stretched for several heartbeats before someone in the crowd whistled softly in appreciation. Morrison had achieved a perfect score under pressure, with dozens of people watching, using an unfamiliar rifle. It was the kind of performance that became legend in military circles. General Caldwell's face went through several color changes as the reality of his defeat sank in. He had challenged Morrison to prove a point about rank and authority, and instead had been thoroughly outclassed in front of his own soldiers. The humiliation was complete and public, witnessed by men who would remember this moment for years to come. Morrison stood up slowly, safing his weapon and placing it on the rack with the same methodical care he'd shown throughout the competition. He didn't celebrate or gloat. His expression remained professionally neutral. But the watching soldiers could see something in his posture that spoke of quiet confidence, the bearing of a man who knew his capabilities and wasn't surprised by his own excellence. "Good shooting," Morrison said to Caldwell, offering the courtesy that military protocol demanded. But Caldwell was beyond the reach of courtesy or protocol. His carefully constructed image as the superior soldier had crumbled in front of everyone, and the rage building inside him was looking for an outlet. The respectful words from Morrison felt like salt in an open wound, a reminder of his complete defeat. "Lucky shots," Caldwell muttered, loud enough for nearby soldiers to hear. "Anyone can get lucky once." The comment hung in the air, obviously unfair and unsportsmanlike. Perfect scores weren't achieved through luck, and everyone present knew it. Morrison's performance had been a display of skill that couldn't be dismissed or minimized. Morrison said nothing in response, understanding that Caldwell's pride had been wounded and that any reply would only make the situation worse. He began walking back toward where his team was gathered, hoping the incident was over. But Caldwell wasn't finished. The humiliation was eating at him like acid, and his anger was building with each step Morrison took away from the firing line. In his mind, this wasn't over. This was just the beginning of a lesson that needed to be taught about respect and proper military hierarchy. As Morrison rejoined his teammates, he could feel the eyes of every soldier on the range following his movement. The competition had changed something fundamental in the dynamics of the base. Word would spread quickly through the barracks and mess halls, and by evening, everyone at Fort Braxton would know that a Navy SEAL medic had outshot their commanding general. Commander Chun fell in a step beside Morrison as they walked toward their equipment. "Nice shooting, Doc," she said quietly, "but I have a feeling this isn't over." Morrison nodded grimly. He'd been in the military long enough to recognize a dangerous enemy when he made one, and General Caldwell's expression had promised retribution. The question wasn't whether there would be consequences, but what form they would take and how severe they would be. Behind them, General Caldwell stood alone on the firing line, surrounded by his staff, but isolated by his anger and embarrassment. The morning had started with him feeling completely in control of his domain, secure in his authority and position. Now, everything felt different. The balance of respect and fear that he'd cultivated so carefully had been damaged by 5 perfect shots from a sailor who should have known his place. As the crowd of soldiers gradually dispersed, conversations buzzed with excitement and speculation. Some praised Morrison's shooting, others worried about what the general might do in response. A few wise old sergeants shook their heads, recognizing the signs of a conflict that was far from over. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, promising another hot day on the base. But the temperature had already risen considerably between General Caldwell and Petty Officer Morrison, and everyone who had witnessed the shooting competition understood that they had seen the opening move in a much larger game. Morrison spent the rest of the morning helping his team set up their improvised medical training facility in the old hangar. The work required focus and attention to detail, but part of his mind kept drifting back to the look in General Caldwell's eyes after the shooting was finished. It was the look of a man who felt his authority had been challenged and who intended to restore it through whatever means necessary. As the SEAL team began their medical training exercises, using makeshift equipment to simulate battlefield conditions, Morrison threw himself into the work with characteristic intensity. Teaching his teammates advanced trauma procedures while under simulated combat stress was exactly the kind of challenge that made him feel most useful and competent. But even as he guided them through complex medical scenarios, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that the real test was still to come. General Caldwell had been humiliated in front of his own soldiers, and men in his position didn't typically accept such defeats gracefully. Whatever was coming next would be designed to restore Caldwell's sense of superiority and put Morrison firmly back in what Caldwell considered his proper place. The afternoon heat shimmered off the concrete as the SEAL team wrapped up their training session. They had accomplished their objectives despite the obstacles placed in their way, adapting and improvising as they had been trained to do. But Morrison knew that their problems at Fort Braxton were far from over, and that the next confrontation with General Caldwell would likely be more serious than a simple marksmanship competition. The dining hall at Fort Braxton buzzed with conversation that evening as soldiers gathered for dinner. News of the morning's shooting competition had spread through the base like wildfire, growing more dramatic with each telling. Some versions had Morrison hitting targets that were impossible to see. Others had General Caldwell storming off in a rage. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment, but military bases thrived on stories that grew larger with each retelling. Morrison sat with his SEAL teammates at a corner table, trying to keep a low profile, while around them the normal dinner conversation seemed charged with extra energy. He'd noticed the looks from other soldiers throughout the day, ranging from respectful nods to curious stares. Being the center of attention wasn't something he enjoyed, especially when that attention came from embarrassing a superior officer. "Doc, you gotta see this," whispered Petty Officer Williams, sliding his phone across the table. On the screen was a text message that had apparently been circulating among the enlisted soldiers. SEAL medic shoots perfect score, while Army general misses the broadside of a barn. Morrison grimaced and slid the phone back. "That's not helping anything, Williams." "Maybe not," said Chief Petty Officer Martinez, the team's senior enlisted man, "but it's got the troops talking. Half the Army guys here are starting to realize their general isn't the war hero he claims to be." Commander Chun appeared at their table, her expression serious. "Doc, I need to speak with you privately." Morrison followed her outside to a quiet area behind the dining hall where they could talk without being overheard. Chun looked tired, and Morrison could guess why. "I just spent 2 hours in meetings about today's incident," Chun began. "General Caldwell is furious, and he's looking for ways to make our lives more difficult." "What kind of ways?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew. "He's filing a complaint about our team's conduct, claiming we showed disrespect for Army authority. He's also requesting that we be reassigned to different quarters and have our access to base facilities further restricted." Morrison shook his head. "All because he challenged me to a shooting competition and lost. It's not about the shooting document. It's about pride and power." Caldwell built his reputation on being the toughest, most experienced soldier on any base he commands. When you outshot him that badly in front of his own troops, you didn't just beat him in a competition. You exposed him. Chun was right. and Morrison knew it. Military hierarchies were built on respect and fear, and when soldiers stopped believing their leaders were superior, the whole system became unstable. Caldwell's authority depended on maintaining an image of competence and dominance, and that image had taken serious damage. "What do you recommend, Commander?" Morrison asked. "Keep your head down and do your job. Don't give him any excuse to escalate this further. We're only here for another 3 weeks, and then we're back to our home base." Morrison nodded, but both of them understood that 3 weeks could feel like a lifetime when a vindictive general was looking for revenge. Caldwell had the power to make their remaining time at Fort Braxton miserable, and his pride had been wounded badly enough that he would probably use that power. Meanwhile, in his office across the base, General Caldwell was indeed planning his response. The spacious room was filled with the symbols of his career, flags from units he'd commanded, photographs from ceremonies, and citations for various achievements. But tonight, all of those accomplishments felt hollow compared to the humiliation he'd suffered that morning. Lieutenant Colonel Barnes sat across from Caldwell's desk, nervously reviewing a stack of reports while his superior paced back and forth behind him. Caldwell had been in this mood since returning from the firing range, and Barnes had learned to recognize the signs of an approaching storm. "Sir," Barnes said carefully, "I've reviewed the regulations regarding the Navy SEAL team's presence here. They have legitimate orders for joint training, and their commanding officer has been following all proper protocols." Caldwell stopped pacing and fixed Barnes with a cold stare. "I don't care about protocols. That medic made me look like a fool in front of my own soldiers, and I won't tolerate it. Perhaps if we simply avoided further confrontations." "No." Caldwell's voice cut through the suggestion like a blade. "Running away from some sailor who got lucky with a rifle isn't an option. These SEALs need to understand that their fancy reputation means nothing on my base." Barnes shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He'd served under Caldwell for 2 years and had learned to navigate his superior's moods, but this felt different. This felt personal in a way that could lead to serious problems for everyone involved. "What do you have in mind, sir?" Barnes asked. Caldwell smiled, but there was no warmth in the expression. "I'm organizing a special training exercise for tomorrow. Combat scenarios, live fire exercises, the works. And I'm personally inviting the SEAL team to participate." "Sir, is that wise?" "If something goes wrong during live fire exercises, nothing will go wrong," Caldwell interrupted. "I'll be personally overseeing every detail. But these SEALs are going to learn what real soldiers can do when they're properly led and motivated." Barnes felt a chill run down his spine. Live fire exercises were dangerous under the best of circumstances, requiring careful planning and strict safety protocols. When conducted by someone with a personal grudge against the participants, they could become deadly. "Sir, perhaps we should review the safety requirements." "The safety requirements will be followed to the letter," Caldwell said firmly. "But accidents happen during training. Sometimes soldiers get hurt when they fail to follow proper procedures or when they're not as skilled as they think they are." The implied threat hung in the air between them. Barnes understood exactly what his general was suggesting, and the knowledge made his stomach turn. But he also understood his own position in the military hierarchy. Questioning Caldwell's decisions too directly could end his career, while going along with them might end someone's life. "Yes, sir," Barnes said quietly. "I'll begin organizing the exercise." The next morning dawned gray and overcast, with thick clouds that promised rain before noon. Morrison and his teammates assembled for their morning briefing, expecting another day of improvised training in the old hangar. Instead, they found Commander Chun reading from a message she'd received just minutes earlier. "Change of plans," she announced. "We've been invited to participate in a special combat training exercise organized by General Caldwell. Live fire scenarios, tactical movements, the full package." The team exchanged glances. After yesterday's confrontation, an invitation from Caldwell felt more like a trap than an opportunity for productive training. "What kind of scenarios?" asked Martinez. "Urban combat simulation, hostage rescue, and precision shooting under stress." all with live ammunition and explosive charges. Morrison felt his instincts screaming warnings. Live fire exercises were inherently dangerous, requiring trust and cooperation between all participants. When conducted by someone who had demonstrated personal hostility, they became exponentially more risky. "Commander," Morrison said carefully, "given yesterday's tension, perhaps we should request more details about the safety protocols." Chen nodded grimly. "I've already done that. Everything appears to be properly organized and supervised. Caldwell knows we can't refuse without looking like we're backing down from a challenge." That was the trap, Morrison realized. Caldwell had crafted a situation where refusing would damage their reputation for courage and competence, while accepting meant placing themselves at the mercy of someone who had every reason to want them humiliated or worse. But everyone stays alert and watches each other's backs. If anything feels wrong, we abort the exercise immediately. An hour later, the SEAL team arrived at the combat training facility, a complex of buildings and obstacles designed to simulate urban warfare conditions. The facility was impressive, with realistic building facades, narrow alleyways, and multiple levels that could be configured for different scenarios. General Caldwell was waiting for them, surrounded by a group of Army officers and senior enlisted men who would be running the exercise. His uniform was pristine as always, but there was something different about his demeanor. The anger from yesterday had been replaced by a cold confidence that Morrison found even more unsettling. "Welcome to real combat training," Caldwell announced to the assembled group. "Today we'll be conducting scenarios that will test your skills, courage, and ability to function under pressure. The Army team will be playing the role of hostile forces, while the Navy SEALs will conduct assault and rescue operations." Morrison noticed several things that increased his unease. First, the Army soldiers who would be opposing them were all from units known for their aggressive training methods. Second, the weapons and ammunition being distributed were standard military issue rather than the training rounds typically used for exercises. Third, Caldwell himself was wearing full combat gear, suggesting he planned to participate directly rather than simply observe. The first scenario, Caldwell continued, involved a hostage situation in Building 3. The SEALs must breach the building, neutralize hostile forces, and rescue civilian hostages. Live ammunition will be used, with strict rules of engagement to ensure safety. Commander Chen stepped forward. "Sir, what are the specific safety protocols? Who will be monitoring the exercise to prevent accidents?" "I will be personally overseeing everything," Caldwell replied. "My officers have extensive experience with these types of exercises. Safety is our top priority, naturally." The way he said "naturally" made Morrison's skin crawl. Everything about this situation felt wrong, from the hostile looks of the Army soldiers to Caldwell's barely contained satisfaction. But backing down now would confirm every negative stereotype about SEALs being prima donnas who couldn't handle real challenges. "We're ready to proceed," Chen announced. The team was issued weapons and given 5 minutes to study building layouts and plan their approach. Morrison found himself assigned to provide medical support while his teammates conducted the actual assault, which meant he would be entering the building after them to treat any casualties from the exercise. As they prepared their equipment, Martinez moved close to Morrison. "Doc, this feels like a setup. That general wants payback for yesterday, and live rounds give him plenty of opportunities." "I know," Morrison whispered back. "But we can't prove anything, and refusing would destroy our reputation. We go through with it, but we stay extra careful and trust our training." The first scenario began with Morrison's teammates approaching Building 3 from multiple angles, while Army soldiers inside played the role of terrorists holding hostages. The rules called for rubber bullets and paint markers to indicate hits rather than live rounds, but Morrison noticed that some of the Army soldiers were carrying standard ammunition pouches rather than the color markers typically used in training exercises. Commander Chen's voice crackled through their radio communications as she led the initial breach. "Moving to entry point Alpha. Martinez, are you in position at the rear exit?" "Affirmative, Commander." Rear exit secured. Morrison waited with the medical equipment 30 meters from the building, close enough to respond quickly if needed, but far enough away to avoid the initial assault. Through his binoculars, he could see Army soldiers moving inside the building, their faces painted with camouflage that made their expressions unreadable. The assault began with a flashbang grenade thrown through a window, followed by Chun and Williams entering through the front door, while Martinez covered the rear. Everything seemed to be proceeding normally until Morrison heard the distinctive crack of live rifle fire instead of the softer pops of training ammunition. Live rounds. Chen's voice shouted through the radio. Someone is using live rounds. Morrison's blood turned to ice. Live ammunition in a training exercise with hostile participants was a recipe for disaster. He grabbed his medical kit and started moving toward the building, knowing that his teammates might need immediate medical attention. More gunfire erupted from inside the building, and Morrison could hear shouting and confusion over the radio communications. The careful choreography of a training exercise was dissolving into chaos, exactly the kind of situation where accidents happened and people got killed. General Caldwell's voice boomed over a loudspeaker from the observation tower. Continue the exercise. This is combat training, not a parade ground demonstration. Morrison reached the building just as Williams came stumbling out the front door, blood streaming from a cut on his forehead. The injury didn't look life-threatening, but Williams was clearly shaken. "Doc," Williams gasped. "It's a nightmare in there. Half these Army guys are shooting live rounds, and Caldwell is doing nothing to stop it." Morrison quickly examined Williams' injury while listening to the ongoing chaos inside the building. Chun and Martinez were still inside, trapped in a situation that had moved far beyond the bounds of safe training. "Commander, this is Doc," Morrison spoke into his radio. "I'm coming in to extract you. This exercise has gone beyond acceptable safety limits. Negative, document too dangerous. We're pinned down on the second floor by..." Chin's transmission was cut off by an explosion that shook the entire building. Smoke began pouring from the upper windows, and Morrison realized that someone had used real explosive charges instead of training simulators. Without hesitation, Morrison grabbed his medical kit and headed for the building entrance. Williams tried to stop him, but Morrison pushed past, driven by the knowledge that his teammates were in immediate danger, and he was the only one who could help them. Inside the building, visibility was nearly zero due to smoke from the explosion. Morrison moved carefully but quickly through the first floor, using his knowledge of the building's layout to navigate toward the staircase. The sound of gunfire was sporadic now, but he could hear voices shouting orders and confusion. "Chun, Martinez, sound off," Morrison called into his radio. "Doc, we're on the second floor, northeast corner." Martinez's voice came back, strain evident in his tone. "Chun is hurt. We need extraction now." Morrison found the staircase and began climbing, his medical training overriding every instinct that told him to get out of the building. The smoke was thicker on the second floor, and he could hear Army soldiers moving around, apparently as confused as everyone else about what was happening. He found Chun and Martinez crouched behind an overturned table, using it as cover while smoke swirled around them. Chun was conscious, but holding her left arm against her body, and Morrison could see blood seeping through her uniform. "What happened?" Morrison asked, immediately beginning to assess Chen's injury. "Shrapnel from that explosion," Chen replied through gritted teeth. "Caught me in the arm and shoulder. Nothing vital hit, but I'm losing blood." Morrison's hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking for arterial damage while applying pressure bandages to control the bleeding. The wound was serious, but not immediately life-threatening if treated properly. "We need to get out of here now," Morrison said. "This whole situation has gone way beyond training parameters." As if to emphasize his point, another burst of gunfire erupted from somewhere else in the building, followed by shouting and the sound of boots running on concrete. Whatever control Caldwell thought he had over this exercise, it was clear that events were spiraling out of his hands. Morrison finished stabilizing Chen's injury and helped Martinez get her to her feet. Moving as a team, They began working their way back toward the staircase while the chaos continued around them. Just as they reached the stairs, General Caldwell's voice boomed over the loudspeaker again. Exercise terminated. All personnel cease fire and exit the building immediately. But the damage was already done. What had started as Caldwell's attempt to humiliate the SEAL team had turned into a dangerous situation where real people had been injured, and the reputation of his command was now in serious jeopardy. Morrison and Martinez helped shun down the stairs, and out of the building, where military police and medical personnel were already responding to reports of injuries during the training exercise. As they emerged into the gray morning light, Morrison could see Army soldiers filing out of other exits, many of them looking confused and concerned about what had just happened. General Caldwell stood near the observation tower, his face showing a mixture of anger and growing realization that his plan for revenge had backfired spectacularly. What should have been a controlled demonstration of Army superiority over Navy SEALs had instead become an uncontrolled situation that would require extensive investigation and explanation. As medics took over Chen's care and began treating her injuries, Morrison looked back at the smoke-damaged building where they had nearly been killed. The morning's events had escalated far beyond a simple personality conflict between a general and a petty officer. This was now a serious incident that would involve official investigations, formal complaints, and potentially criminal charges. But even as Morrison provided his initial report to the military police officers who were already gathering witness statements, he could see that General Caldwell was far from finished with his campaign of retaliation. The failed exercise had only deepened his humiliation and increased his determination to prove his superiority over the SEAL team. The rain that had been threatening all morning finally began to fall, washing some of the smoke away from the training facility, but doing nothing to clean up the mess that Caldwell's pride and anger had created. As Morrison watched ambulances arrive to transport the injured, he realized that the most dangerous confrontations were still to come. The base hospital at Fort Braxton hummed with activity as medical personnel treated the casualties from the disastrous training exercise. Commander Chen lay on a gurney in the emergency treatment area, her left arm and shoulder wrapped in professional bandages that had replaced Morrison's field dressings. The doctors confirmed what Morrison had already determined: serious but not life-threatening injuries that would require surgery to remove all the shrapnel fragments. Morrison sat in the waiting area, still wearing his smoke-stained combat gear, filling out paperwork for the military police investigation that was already underway. The forms asked detailed questions about what he had witnessed during the exercise, and Morrison found himself carefully choosing his words. He wanted to be truthful about the dangerous conditions they had faced, but he also understood that his statements could have serious legal implications for everyone involved. Across the waiting room, several Army soldiers from the exercise were being treated for minor injuries and smoke inhalation. Morrison could hear fragments of their conversations, and it was clear that many of them were just as confused and concerned about what had happened as he was. Whatever General Caldwell had told his officers about the exercise, it seemed that the enlisted soldiers had not been fully informed about the unusual conditions they would be facing. Petty Officer Morrison, a tall man in dress uniform, approached, his bearing and insignia identifying him as a senior officer from outside the base. "I'm Colonel Anderson from the Inspector General's office. I need to speak with you about this morning's incident." Morrison stood and followed Anderson to a small conference room where they could speak privately. Anderson was a lean man in his 50s with gray hair and the kind of serious expression that suggested he had investigated many similar incidents during his career. "I want you to understand that this conversation is part of an official investigation," Anderson began. "Your statements will be recorded and may be used in subsequent legal proceedings. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." Anderson activated a digital recorder and began asking detailed questions about the training exercise, from the initial briefing to the moment when live ammunition was first used. Morrison answered truthfully, describing the safety concerns he had felt from the beginning and the escalating danger as the exercise progressed. "In your professional opinion," Anderson asked, Were proper safety protocols followed during this exercise? Morrison considered his answer carefully. Sir, based on my experience with live fire training exercises, several critical safety measures were either inadequately implemented or completely ignored. The mixing of live ammunition with training rounds, the lack of clear communication about engagement rules, and the apparent absence of effective exercise control all created an unnecessarily dangerous situation. Did you observe any actions by General Caldwell that contributed to these unsafe conditions? Sir, I observed that General Caldwell insisted the exercise continue even after live rounds were identified and injuries occurred. He also appeared to be personally supervising activities that would normally be handled by specialized training personnel. Anderson made notes on a legal pad while the recorder continued running. Are you aware of any personal animosity between General Caldwell and members of your SEAL team? Morrison hesitated. This question went to the heart of what had really caused the morning's disaster, but answering it honestly would require him to discuss the shooting competition and Caldwell's subsequent behavior. Sir, there was a marksmanship competition yesterday between General Caldwell and myself. The general challenged me publicly, and when I performed better than expected, he seemed to take the results personally. Can you elaborate on his reaction? Morrison described Caldwell's anger after the shooting competition and his comments about the SEALs needing to be taught respect for Army authority. Anderson listened without comment, but Morrison could see that the investigator was building a picture of events that painted Caldwell in an increasingly unfavorable light. After another hour of questions, Anderson concluded the interview and dismissed Morrison with instructions to remain available for follow-up questions. As Morrison left the conference room, he encountered Martinez in the hallway. "How's the commander?" Morrison asked. "Surgery went well. Doctors got all the shrapnel out, and she should make a full recovery. But she's going to be out of action for at least 6 weeks." Morrison nodded, relieved that Chin's injuries weren't worse, but concerned about what this meant for their team's operational status. Losing their commanding officer in the middle of a training deployment would normally be serious enough, but given the circumstances of her injury, it also raised questions about their safety if they remained at Fort Braxton. "Doc," Martinez said quietly, "word is spreading about what really happened during that exercise. Some of the Army guys are talking to investigators, and apparently they're not too happy about being used as pawns in Caldwell's personal vendetta." That was encouraging news. If Army soldiers were willing to testify about the dangerous conditions during the exercise, it would support Morrison's account and potentially lead to serious consequences for General Caldwell. "What about our orders?" Morrison asked. "Are we staying here for the rest of the deployment?" "Unknown. Higher command is reviewing the situation, but for now we're confined to base pending the investigation." Morrison understood the politics involved. Until the investigation was complete, removing the SEAL team from Fort Braxton might look like an admission that they had done something wrong. But keeping them there meant continued exposure to a commanding officer who had already demonstrated his willingness to put their lives at risk. Meanwhile, in his office, General Caldwell was facing his own investigators and finding the experience far less comfortable than he had expected. Colonel Anderson had been joined by 2 other officers from the Inspector General's office, and their questions were becoming increasingly pointed as they gathered evidence about the training exercise. "General," Anderson was saying, "multiple witnesses have testified that you ordered the exercise to continue even after safety protocols had clearly been violated. Can you explain your reasoning?" Caldwell shifted in his chair, suddenly aware that the confidence he had felt that morning was evaporating rapidly. "Combat training is inherently dangerous. Soldiers need to learn to function under realistic conditions. But this wasn't combat, sir. This was a training exercise with specific safety requirements. When those requirements are ignored, training becomes reckless endangerment." "I was maintaining operational realism, sir," interrupted Major Williams, another investigator. "We have testimony from your own soldiers stating that they were confused about the rules of engagement and that some units were issued live ammunition while others received training rounds. That's not operational realism. That's a recipe for friendly fire incidents." Caldwell felt the walls closing in around him. What had seemed like a reasonable plan to humble some arrogant SEALs was being dissected by professional investigators who saw only dangerous negligence and poor leadership. Furthermore, Anderson continued, we have multiple witnesses who heard you make disparaging comments about the Navy SEAL team prior to the exercise. This raises serious questions about your motivations for organizing the training in the first place. My motivations were purely professional, Caldwell insisted, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded. The investigators exchanged glances that suggested they had heard enough. General, pending completion of this investigation, you are being temporarily relieved of command. Colonel Barnes will assume acting command of the base until a permanent replacement arrives. Caldwell's world tilted on its axis. Being relieved of command was a career-ending event that would follow him for the rest of his life. All because of shooting competition he should never have started and a training exercise that had spiraled completely out of control. Sir, I request the opportunity to explain. Your explanations are part of the official record, Anderson said firmly. This investigation will be thorough and fair, but until it's complete, you cannot continue in command. As the investigators filed out of his office, Caldwell sat alone among the symbols of a military career that was effectively over. The photographs and citations that had once filled him with pride now seemed like monuments to his foolishness and arrogance. Word of Caldwell's relief from command spread through Fort Braxton within hours, carried by the efficient network of military gossip that existed on every base. Reactions varied depending on who was commenting, but among the enlisted soldiers who had served under his leadership, there was more relief than surprise. Morrison learned about it from Williams, who found him in the temporary quarters where the SEAL team had been relocated while the investigation continued. Doc, you need to hear this, Williams said excitedly. Caldwell's been relieved. Colonel Barnes is running the base now, and apparently he's already issued new standing orders about joint training exercises. Morrison felt a mixture of relief and concern. Relief that they would no longer be under the direct authority of someone who had proven willing to endanger their lives, but concern about what Caldwell might do now that his military career was essentially over. What about the criminal investigation? Morrison asked. Still ongoing, but some of the guys are saying it's looking bad for the general. Apparently, several of his own officers are testifying that he specifically ordered them to make the exercise as difficult as possible for us. That evening, Morrison visited Commander Chun in the hospital. She was alert and in good spirits despite her injuries, but the conversations around her bed focused on the implications of the day's events. Doc, Chun said as soon as he sat down, I've been in contact with our command back home. They're discussing whether to pull us out of Fort Braxton immediately or finish the deployment under the new leadership. What's your recommendation, Commander? Part of me wants to get the hell out of here before anything else goes wrong. But another part thinks we shouldn't let one bad general chase us away from completing our mission. Morrison understood her dilemma. SEALs prided themselves on completing their assignments regardless of obstacles. But there was a difference between overcoming challenges and tolerating unnecessary risks created by personal animosity. The new base commander seems reasonable, Morrison offered, and with Caldwell gone, most of our problems should disappear. She nodded slowly. That's my thinking too. Plus, if we leave now, it might look like we're running from the investigation. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. Colonel Barnes entered, looking uncomfortable but determined. He was a small man with thinning hair and the demeanor of someone who had spent his career in administrative positions rather than combat commands. Commander Chun, Petty Officer Morrison, Barnes began formally. I want to apologize for what happened during this morning's exercise. It was inexcusable, and I'm committed to ensuring nothing like this occurs again. Thank you, sir, Chun replied. We appreciate your concern. Barnes shifted his weight nervously. I also wanted you to know that I've reviewed the original orders for your training deployment, and I see no reason why you can't complete your mission here under much more appropriate conditions. Morrison could see that Barnes was trying to repair the damage done by his predecessor, but he also sensed that the colonel was nervous about having SEALs on his base after everything that had happened. "Sir, what security measures are in place regarding General Caldwell?" Morrison asked. "He's been relieved of command, but he still has access to the base." Barnes' expression grew more serious. "Actually, that's one of the things I wanted to discuss. General Caldwell has been ordered to remain in his quarters except for investigation meetings and medical appointments. He's also been assigned a military police escort when he does leave his quarters. Is he considered dangerous?" Chun asked bluntly. "Let's just say that the investigators are taking appropriate precautions," Barnes replied diplomatically. "Your safety is our top priority." After Barnes left, Morrison and Chun discussed the implications of what they had learned. Caldwell's relief from command was just the beginning of a process that could lead to court-martial proceedings and criminal charges. But until that process was complete, he remained a potential threat to anyone he blamed for his downfall. "Doc," Chun said as Morrison prepared to leave, "I want you to be extra careful for the next few days. Caldwell's military career is over because of what happened, and men like him don't always accept responsibility for their own actions." Morrison nodded, understanding her concern. He had seen how personal Caldwell's hatred had become, and desperate people sometimes did desperate things regardless of the consequences. As he walked back to his quarters through the evening air, Morrison noticed military police vehicles stationed at various points around the base. The increased security was reassuring, but it also served as a reminder that the situation was far from resolved. In his room that night, Morrison reviewed the events of the past 2 days, trying to understand how a simple marksmanship competition had escalated into a situation that had ended a general's career and nearly gotten several people killed. The answer, he realized, lay in the dangerous combination of wounded pride and unchecked authority that had driven Caldwell to increasingly reckless actions. But as Morrison prepared for sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the general's story wasn't over yet. Men who had built their identities around military success and authority didn't typically accept defeat gracefully, especially when they blamed others for their downfall. Whatever came next, Morrison suspected that General Caldwell's final confrontation with the SEAL team was still to come. Outside his window, the base settled into its nighttime routine with guards patrolling and lights casting long shadows across empty parade grounds. The physical environment looked peaceful, but Morrison knew that beneath the surface, tensions were still building towards some kind of resolution that would determine not just the fate of the investigation, but the safety of everyone involved. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Morrison was awakened before dawn by Martinez, shaking his shoulder urgently. "Doc, wake up. We've got a serious problem." Morrison sat up immediately, his combat training bringing him to full alertness within seconds. "What's wrong?" "General Caldwell is missing." His military police escort found his quarters empty when they arrived for the morning check. Base security is conducting a full search, but so far there's no sign of him. Morrison felt ice form in his stomach. A disgraced general who blamed the SEAL team for his downfall, now missing from a base where he had detailed knowledge of security procedures and access routes, represented a serious threat to everyone involved. "How long has he been gone?" Morrison asked, already reaching for his gear. "Unknown. He was accounted for at the 10 p.m. security check, but that's the last confirmed sighting. He could have been gone for up to 8 hours. 8 hours was more than enough time for Caldwell to plan and execute almost any kind of revenge scenario he might have in mind." Morrison's training kicked in, analyzing potential threats and defensive measures while he prepared for what might be coming next. As Morrison and Martinez made their way to the emergency briefing that Colonel Barnes had called, Morrison couldn't help but think that the most dangerous phase of this confrontation was just beginning. A general with nothing left to lose and a personal grudge against the people he blamed for his downfall was exactly the kind of threat that SEAL training prepared them to handle. But this time, the threat was coming from someone who knew their location, their routines, and their vulnerabilities. This time, they would be fighting on ground that their enemy knew better than they did. The emergency briefing room at Fort Braxton buzzed with tense energy as military personnel from multiple units gathered to address the crisis of General Caldwell's disappearance. Colonel Barnes stood at the front of the room, his nervous demeanor replaced by the focused determination of an officer dealing with a genuine security threat. Maps of the base and surrounding area cover the walls, marked with search grids and security checkpoints. Morrison sat with the remaining members of his SEAL team, all of them fully armed and equipped despite being technically in a safe rear area. The reality that a missing general with intimate knowledge of the base layout represented a serious threat had shifted everyone's mindset from administrative processing to active security operations. "Listen up," Barnes began, his voice carrying more authority than Morrison had heard from him before. "General Caldwell was last seen at 2,200 hours yesterday evening in his quarters. When a morning security check was conducted at 0600, his room was empty and showed signs of hasty departure. His service weapon is missing, along with several items from his personal equipment." Martinez leaned over to Morrison. "Doc, this is bad. An armed general with a grudge, and 8 hours to plan whatever he's got in mind." Barnes continued the briefing. "Base security has been enhanced, and we've contacted local law enforcement to assist in the search. However, given General Caldwell's extensive military training and his intimate knowledge of this facility, we must assume he represents a credible threat to personnel safety." Major Thompson, the base security officer, stepped forward to address the group. "We've identified several possible scenarios. First, Caldwell may have simply left the base to avoid the ongoing investigation. Second, he may be hiding somewhere on the base with the intention of escaping later. Third, and most concerning, he may be planning some form of retaliation against individuals he blames for his situation." Morrison felt every eye in the room turned toward the SEAL team. They were obviously the most likely targets for any revenge scenario Caldwell might have planned. "What security measures are being implemented?" asked Chief Martinez. "Enhanced patrols throughout the base, particularly around sensitive areas and personnel quarters," Thompson replied. "We've also established a communication protocol so that any sighting can be immediately reported and responded to." Barnes looked directly at the SEAL team. "Given the personal nature of General Caldwell's conflict with your unit, we're implementing special security measures for your team. You'll be moved to secure quarters with constant protection, and your movements on base will be restricted and escorted." Morrison understood the necessity of the precautions, but he also recognized how they would limit the team's ability to respond if Caldwell made aggressive moves. Being protected also meant being contained, which could be disadvantageous if the situation escalated to active combat. "Sir," Morrison said, "with respect, my team is trained to handle threats like this. Restricting our movement might actually increase our vulnerability rather than decrease it." Barnes considered this. "What do you recommend?" "Let us maintain our normal routines with enhanced awareness and communication. If General Caldwell is planning something, he'll expect us to be locked down and protected. Giving us freedom of movement might disrupt his plans and give us tactical advantages." Thompson looked skeptical. "That's a significant risk. We're talking about a career military officer with extensive combat experience and knowledge of this base. It's also a disgraced officer who's lost his command and is facing criminal charges," Martinez pointed out. "Desperate people make mistakes, especially when they're operating alone." Barnes weighed the options. "I'll allow modified freedom of movement, but with enhanced communication requirements and backup always within immediate response distance. Any deviation from approved locations must be reported immediately." As the briefing concluded, Morrison couldn't shake the feeling that they were still reacting to Caldwell's initiative rather than seizing control of the situation. 8 hours was plenty of time for an experienced officer to set up an ambush or create conditions favorable to his objectives. The team was escorted to new quarters in a building that offered better security and fields of fire, but Morrison noticed that their new location also made them more predictable. Caldwell would know exactly where they were staying and could plan accordingly. As the afternoon wore on, several false alarms kept the base on edge. A security guard thought he saw someone in camouflage near the motor pool, but investigation revealed only shadows and nervous imagination. A maintenance worker reported finding evidence that someone had been in the abandoned training building, but military police found nothing conclusive. This is what he wants, Morrison told his teammates as they reviewed the situation in their secure quarters. Keep us jumpy and reactive while he maintains the initiative. Williams looked up from a radio equipment he was monitoring. Doc, what if we're overthinking this? Maybe the general just got spooked by the investigation and decided to run. Possible, Morrison admitted, but unlikely. Everything we've seen from Caldwell suggests he's too proud to run away. He's more likely to try for some kind of dramatic gesture that lets him feel like he's won. Martinez checked his weapon for the dozenth time. Question is, what kind of gesture? Direct confrontation, or something more subtle? Before Morrison could answer, their radio crackled with an urgent transmission from base security. All units, be advised that we have a confirmed sighting of General Caldwell in the vicinity of Building 7. Military police are responding, but all personnel in that area should exercise extreme caution. Building 7 was the administrative complex that housed personnel records and investigation files. Morrison felt a chill as he realized what Caldwell might be after. He's going for the investigation records, Morrison said. If he can destroy evidence or steal files, he might be able to disrupt the case against him. The radio crackled again. Security teams report Building 7 appears to be empty. No sign of General Caldwell, but there is evidence of forced entry into several offices. Morrison made a decision. We need to get over there. If Caldwell is playing games with the investigation, our testimony and evidence might be at risk. Doc, Martinez warned, that could be exactly what he wants. Draw us out of secure quarters into a location he's already scouted. Maybe, but we can't let him destroy evidence that might be crucial to the investigation. Besides, sitting here waiting for him to make his move isn't working. Morrison contacted Colonel Barnes to request permission to assist with securing the administrative building. After a brief discussion, Barnes agreed but insisted on military police escort and radio communication every 15 minutes. As they moved through the base toward Building 7, Morrison noticed how different everything felt with the knowledge the hostile force was operating in their midst. Normal activities continued, but there was an underlying tension that affected everyone's behavior. Soldiers moved in groups rather than alone, and everyone seemed to be watching the shadows more carefully. Building 7 was a 3-story concrete structure that contained offices for various administrative functions. Military police had cordoned off the area, but Morrison could see through the windows that several offices had been ransacked. Captain Rodriguez, the military police commander, briefed them on the situation. Looks like someone went through multiple offices searching for specific files. Most of the damage is on the second floor, where investigation records are stored. Any sign of what was taken? Morrison asked. Hard to tell. Files were scattered, computers were accessed, and some documents appear to be missing. We'll need forensic analysis to determine exactly what was compromised. Morrison studied the building layout and the pattern of destruction. Something about the scene didn't feel right, but he couldn't immediately identify what was bothering him. Captain, Morrison said, this looks almost too obvious. If Caldwell wanted to steal or destroy specific files, he could have done it much more quietly. This looks like he wanted us to know he'd been here. Rodriguez frowned. You think it's a diversion? Possible. Or bait to draw specific people to this location. As if summoned by Morrison's words, Williams' radio crackled with another transmission from base security. All units, we have reports of suspicious activity near the base hospital. Possible sighting of General Caldwell in that vicinity. Morrison's blood turned cold. Commander Chun was still recovering in the hospital, basically defenseless and certainly unable to defend herself effectively. If Caldwell was targeting members of the SEAL team individually, she would be an easy and symbolic target. We need to get to the hospital now, Morrison said. Rodriguez nodded grimly. I'll call for additional units to respond there immediately. But As they prepared to leave Building 7, Morrison heard a sound that made him freeze. It was the distinctive metallic click of a rifle bolt being chambered, coming from somewhere inside the building they had just searched. "Contact!" Morrison shouted, diving behind a concrete barrier as the first shots rang out. General Caldwell's voice boomed from an upper-floor window. "Finally! I was beginning to think you Navy heroes were too scared to show yourselves." More shots followed, accurate rifle fire that forced the military police and SEAL team to take cover behind vehicles and concrete barriers. Morrison could see muzzle flashes from a third-floor window, indicating that Caldwell had positioned himself with excellent fields of fire covering the entire area. This is what he planned all along, Morrison realized, speaking in his radio while bullets whined overhead. The hospital report was false. He wanted us here, in the open, where he could engage us on his terms. Captain Rodriguez was coordinating the response from behind an armored vehicle. "I've got sniper teams moving to counter his position, but it's going to take time. Time we might not have," Martinez replied, pointing toward the building. "Look at the third floor." Morrison followed his gaze and saw smoke beginning to pour from several windows. Caldwell had apparently set fires throughout the building, creating additional chaos and probably destroying more evidence in the process. "He's going to burn the whole building," Williams observed. "Take us with him if he can." Morrison studied the tactical situation with the analytical mind that had kept him alive through 3 combat tours. Caldwell had chosen his position well, with good fields of fire and multiple escape routes. But he was also trapped in a building that was now burning, which would eventually force him to move. "Rodriguez," Morrison called, "can your sniper teams get clear shots at his position?" "Working on it, but he's got good concealment and multiple firing positions. Every time we move to get an angle, he shifts location." Morrison made a decision that his training told him was necessary, but dangerous. "I'm going to enter the building from the rear and work my way up to his level. If I can get behind him, I can either capture him or force him to expose himself to your snipers." "Negative, Doc," Martinez said immediately. "That's suicide. You'd be going into a burning building against a trained sniper who knows you're coming." "It's also the only way to end this before someone gets killed," Morrison replied. "Caldwell is out of control, and he's not going to surrender voluntarily." Captain Rodriguez looked skeptical. "Petty Officer Morrison, I cannot authorize you to enter that building. It's too dangerous, and we have other options." "What other options?" "Wait for him to run out of ammunition. Hope he gets overcome by smoke before he kills someone. He's already proven he's willing to risk other people's lives to satisfy his ego." Another burst of rifle fire punctuated Morrison's argument, bullets striking dangerously close to their position. Caldwell was maintaining steady, accurate fire that kept everyone pinned down and prevented effective response. "Doc," Martinez said quietly, "if you're going in there, you're not going alone." Morrison looked at his teammate, seeing the same determination in Martinez's eyes that he felt in his own mind. They had trained together for years, fought together in multiple deployments, and trusted each other completely. "Two-man team," Morrison agreed. "Williams, you coordinate with Rodriguez and provide communication relay." Before Rodriguez could object further, Morrison and Martinez were moving toward the rear of the building, using smoke from the fires as concealment while they approached an emergency exit that appeared to be unguarded. The interior of Building 7 was filling with smoke, but the fires seemed to be concentrated on the second floor rather than spreading throughout the structure. Morrison led the way up a rear staircase, moving carefully but quickly toward the third floor where Caldwell was positioned. As they climbed, they could hear Caldwell shouting challenges and taunts toward the people pinned down outside. "Come on, you SEAL heroes. Show me what makes you so special." Morrison and Martinez reached the third floor and began moving through the corridors toward the sound of Caldwell's voice. The smoke was thicker here, but visibility was still adequate for close-quarters operations. They found Caldwell in a corner office that gave him commanding views of the area where the security forces were positioned. He had barricaded the door, and was firing through windows that he had broken out for better fields of fire. His rifle was a standard military M4, and he appeared to have several loaded magazines available. Morrison studied the tactical situation. Caldwell was focused on targets outside, and didn't seem to realize that anyone was inside the building with him. His position was strong for engaging external targets, but it was vulnerable to attack from behind. Using hand signals, Morrison indicated to Martinez that they would approach from two different angles, giving them crossfire capability and reducing the chance that Caldwell could engage both of them effectively. As they moved into position, Morrison reflected on how completely the situation had deteriorated from a simple marksmanship competition to this life-or-death confrontation in a burning building. But he also knew that it had to end here, one way or another. Caldwell had proven that he would continue escalating until someone stopped him permanently. Morrison took a deep breath, checked his weapon one final time, and prepared to confront the general who had let pride and anger drive him to this desperate final stand. The smoke-filled corridors of Building 7 felt like a maze as Morrison and Martinez positioned themselves for their final confrontation with General Caldwell. Through the haze, they could hear him continuing to fire sporadically at the security forces outside, while muttering angry comments about Navy SEALs and their arrogance. The man had completely lost touch with reality, driven by rage and humiliation to this desperate last stand. Morrison crept closer to the office where Caldwell had barricaded himself, moving with the silent precision that had kept him alive through countless dangerous missions. Behind him, Martinez took a different route that would give them crossfire capability when they made their move. Both men understood that this confrontation would likely determine not just their own survival, but whether Caldwell's rampage claimed additional victims. As Morrison reached the doorway to Caldwell's improvised fortress, he could see the general clearly for the first time since the shooting began. Caldwell looked haggard and disheveled, his uniform torn and stained with smoke. His eyes had the wild intensity of someone who had crossed a line from which there was no return. He was holding the rifle with competent familiarity, but his movements showed the jittery energy of extreme stress and anger. Morrison made a tactical decision that went against every instinct he had developed during his military career. Instead of simply shooting Caldwell from behind, which would have been the safest and most efficient solution, he chose to try one final attempt at peaceful resolution. "General Caldwell," Morrison called out, his voice cutting through the smoke and noise. "This is Petty Officer Morrison. I'm here to talk." Caldwell spun around with lightning reflexes, his rifle trained on Morrison's position. For a moment, the two men faced each other across the smoke-filled room, each with the power to end the other's life in an instant. The famous Navy SEAL medic, Caldwell said, his voice thick with sarcasm and rage. "Come to show me how special you really are? I can't give you a chance to end this before anyone else gets hurt." Morrison replied, keeping his own weapon lowered, but ready. "You're a career officer with decades of service. Don't let this be how your story ends." Caldwell laughed bitterly. "My story? My story ended when you embarrassed me in front of my own soldiers. Everything since then has just been the aftermath." Morrison could see that reasoning with Caldwell was probably impossible, but his medical training and natural inclination toward preserving life made him continue trying. "Sir, you made the choice to challenge me to that shooting competition. I just did my best with the skills I've developed. There's no shame in losing a competition to someone who specializes in marksmanship." "Specializes?" Caldwell's voice rose dangerously. "You're a medic. Your job is to patch up real soldiers after they do the fighting. But somehow you think you're better than a general with 30 years of combat experience." Morrison realized that Caldwell's anger went much deeper than a simple shooting competition. This was about a worldview that couldn't accept that competence might be more important than rank, or that an enlisted sailor might possess skills that exceeded those of a career officer. "General, I never claimed to be better than anyone. I'm just good at certain things, just like you're good at others. That's why militaries need people with different specialties." But Caldwell was beyond the reach of logic or respect. "Different specialties? I've commanded thousands of soldiers. I've planned operations that saved American lives, and I'm supposed to be impressed by some sailor who can hit targets at a shooting range. Morrison could hear sirens outside as fire trucks arrived to deal with the blazes that Caldwell had set throughout the building. Time was running out for all of them, and the smoke was getting thicker by the minute. "Sir, we need to get out of this building before it becomes unsafe. Whatever issues we have can be worked out, but not if we're all overcome by smoke inhalation." Caldwell's grip on his rifle tightened. "I'm not going anywhere. This is where it ends. Morrison, you destroyed my career, my reputation, everything I worked 30 years to build. The least you can do is face the consequences." Morrison saw that Martinez had moved into position and was ready to take action if negotiations failed completely. But Morrison also noticed something that changed his entire perception of the situation. General Caldwell was crying. Beneath the rage and bluster, tears were streaming down his face as the full weight of his destroyed life hit him. "General," Morrison said gently, "I'm sorry your career ended this way. That was never my intention, but you still have choices. You can walk out of here and face whatever comes next."